Sometimes a moment in history is encapsulated or perfectly summarized by an event or a moment or a person, or in this case, a political cartoon. A cartoon published in 1906 called In the Rubber Coils is probably the lasting image that comes from the Congo Free State. If you're listening to this podcast now, you've probably seen this image. And if you were just to search up the Belgian Congo or the Congo Free State, this would be one of the first images that comes up. It's taught in classrooms. It's in all of the books on the subject. And it's lasted for over 100 years as, in some ways, the defining image that comes from this period. The cartoon depicts a man from the Congo being squeezed and surrounded and suffocated by a giant snake. The snake looks like a rubber vine, and at the head of the snake is King Leopold II of Belgium. The image illustrates the atrocities and the cruelty of Leopold. It shows the devastation that happened to the people, the disruption of families because there is a wife and child in the background looking back but running away. It depicts how the rubber regime that we talked about in the last episode is sapping away any vestiges of integrity or humanity for the people of Africa. And it captures the moment. It captures the hopelessness and the inherent violence and the feeling of being trapped that many people in the Congo must have felt. But importantly, it also illustrates an awareness on the part of, obviously, the person who drew the cartoon, but this was something that was published in a newspaper in Europe and had a wide readership and obviously spread to other places around the globe. So it illustrates an awareness and a popular opinion at the time that there were atrocities going on in the Congo and that this was related to the rubber vine extraction process that we talked about. And there were people who felt like King Leopold of Belgium had a lot to answer for. As we're going to learn about here in this episode, there was a massive human rights campaign led by a guy named Morel. This campaign was international. It was multimedia. It was real journalism, getting reports from people on the ground in the Congo. But it was also opinion pieces and public relations and a shadow war in Europe between Morel, his journalists and his human rights activists, and King Leopold II and the people on his payroll trying to influence public opinion. And so under the surface of this cartoon in the rubber coils, we get hints of this shadow war that's going on behind the scenes. But it's also important to note that resistance to Leopold, resistance to imperialism in Africa, and resistance to the Congo Free State was not just a white European thing. There was direct African resistance that was extensive, consistent, and while not always entirely effective in achieving its goal, at least in the immediate moment, it did lay the foundation for a Congolese independence movement that would eventually be realized in 1960, however flawed that realization may have ended up being. Historian Adam Hochschild says, quote, "The force publique had its hands full. Many of the king's new subjects belonged to warrior peoples who fought back. More than a dozen different ethnic groups staged major rebellions against Leopold's rule. The Yaka people fought the whites for more than 10 years before they were subdued in 1906. The Chokwe fought for 20 years, inflicting heavy casualties on Leopold's soldiers. The Boa and Buja mobilized more than 5,000 men to fight a guerrilla war from deep within the rainforest. Just as Americans used the words pacification in Vietnam 70 years later, so the Force Publique's military expeditions were officially called Reconnaissance Pacifique." End quote. The Sangha people in southern Congo led by a man named Muleme Nyama, rebelled against Leopold's rule, eventually being pinned into a cave system where 178 men were surrounded, the entrances to the caves blocked, and fires lit in order to smoke them out. But instead, they died to the last man. Another local chief named Nsanzu led a uprising and rebellion, killing force public officers, burning and pillaging local state outposts, and maybe most importantly for the officials of the Congo Free State, interrupting the trade routes. This went on for years before the rebellion petered out. Historian Georges Zangola Talaja talks about the African resistance to the Congo Free State, saying, quote, "Between 1891 and 1908, the history of the Congo Free State was above all a history of African resistance to the imposition of colonial rule." End quote. Zangola Talaja highlights the internal rebellions in the force publique, remember, which are made up primarily of Congolese men. And he says, quote, "The internal dynamics of the colonial army constitute the background to the military revolts. The force publique had three categories of Africans. The first was made up of soldiers, in the strict sense of the word, enlisted men and non-commissioned officers up to the rank of sergeant. The second category consisted of military workers, or people retained for maintenance work and food growing in and around military camps. The third and last category was that of porters, who were needed to transport equipment and supplies during military campaigns. White officers, many of whom were psychopaths, sadists, and incorrigible racists, subjected all three categories to harsh treatment. They took great pleasure in torturing their African subordinates, meting out the statutory 100 lashes of the shakab at the slightest provocation. Moreover, the pay was low and not regular, and food was usually inadequate in both quality and quantity. Under the circumstances, the perception of gross injustice in a stressful context was the spark needed to ignite a revolt." End quote. He goes on to highlight three major revolts of the force publique, one in 1895, one in 1897, and one in 1900. These could involve thousands of people and oftentimes took years to put down. And some were never put down. Resistance members fading back into their communities, or what was left of them, or oftentimes crossing the border into a different territory. And so while all of this African resistance is going on in the Congo, there's also resistance from a human rights campaign that's going on in Europe. And it's really led by one guy. His name is Edmund Morel. At the beginning of all this, he's working for a company called Elder Dempster, which is a shipping company that travels back and forth between Belgium and Congo. And as Morel is looking at the books and as he's looking at just the ships that are leaving and coming, he notices three things. First of all, there's a huge number of guns and ammo going into the Congo. And then he notices that for all of the imports of rubber and ivory, just huge amounts of these resources that Belgium is getting, there's nothing being traded for those things. So the only way that this is possible is with slavery and forced labor. He looks deeper. He realizes that people are cooking the books and there's huge profits and amounts of rubber that are being skimmed off the top and not reported. Nothing's adding up, and he starts digging deeper. He quits his job at the shipping company. He begins writing a newspaper publication called the West African Mail. He's writing and editing hundreds of pieces, books, articles, newspaper editings, pamphlets. He's publishing in different language, and he's exposing all of the atrocities that are going on in the Congo. Morel said that he had a, quote, determination to do my best to expose and destroy what I then knew to be a legalized infamy, accompanied by unimaginable barbarities and responsible for a vast destruction of human life. End quote. He also said that, quote, to have sat still would have been temperamentally impossible, end quote. Morel becomes the head of a multimedia campaign that's going on in the early 1900s, but in a lot of ways it looks very similar to what we might see today with newsletters on social media, people wanting to control the narrative, and sometimes in this battle between his media agents and Leopold's media agents, sometimes getting people to believe your story is more important than the story itself. And in this sense, Morel is fighting uphill, just like people in the modern day who have the truth on their side are often fighting uphill against misinformation and lies that can spread hundreds of times, thousands of times faster. What's interesting is that once Morel's newspaper and newsletter operation gets going, people in the Congo start coming to him with scoops. So he's publishing the names of dead people in the Congo, like obituaries. He's publishing missionary accounts of atrocities. And he's publishing people who witnessed hands getting chopped off or torture scenes. Or he's talking about the details of killing of hundreds of people in forced marches or rubber extraction projects. A decent chunk, not all of it, but some of what we know about the Congo during this time period comes from people sending Morel firsthand accounts and him publishing them and getting that in the historical record. So he's an important guy, not just for having the courage to stand up to authority and try to do the right thing, but he also helps historians out by publishing this for the future generations to uncover. Morel is not afraid to team up with other people who are on the same page as him, one of which was Roger Casement, who was the British consul in the Congo. And we mentioned Casement in the last episode, but they both are outraged by what's going on in the Congo. They develop a friendship. Casement is sending him reports and things that he's seeing in the Congo, and he calls it, quote, instead of lifting up the native populations submitted to and suffering from it, it can, if persisted in, lead only to their final extinction and the universal condemnation of civilized mankind, end quote. That is a damning description of what was going on in the Congo, and Casement's diary entries, which we now have access to, are equally as terrible. Quote, June 5th, the country a desert, no natives left. July 25th, I walked into villages and saw the nearest one, population dreadfully decreased, only 93 people left out of many hundreds. July 26th, poor, frail folk. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Where then are the kindly heart, the pitiful thought, together vanished. August 6th, took copious notes from natives. They are cruelly flogged for being late with their baskets of rubber. Very tired. August 13th, A came to say 5 people from Bakoro side with hands cut off come as far as Mianga intending to show me. August 22nd, Balanga quite dead. I remember it well, in 1887. Full of people then. Now, 14 adults, all told. I should say people wretched, complained bitterly of rubber tax. 6:30, past deserted side of Bakuta. Mozita says the people were all taken away by force to Mampoko. Poor, unhappy souls. August 29th, saw a rubber, quote-unquote, market. Nothing but guns, about 20 armed men. The population, 242 men with rubber all guarded like convicts. To call this trade is the height of lying. August 30th, 16 men, women, and children tied up from a village close to the town. Infamous. The men were put in the prison, the children let go at my intervention. Infamous. Infamous, shameful system. August 31st. In the evening, a dance was organized in my honor. All the local chiefs and their wives came. Poor souls, I was sorry for it. Of all the forced enjoyment I ever saw, this took the cake. September 2nd, saw 16 women seized by Peter's sentries and taken off to prison. September 9th, the poor people put off in canoe to implore my help. End quote. Casement puts out his own report of what's going on in the Congo. Morel amplifies it and continues to publish accounts from it. Morel would later write, quote, "Thus the African is really helpless against the material gods of the white man, as embodied in the trinity of imperialism, capitalistic exploitation, and militarism." End quote. As Casement and Morel's message is being amplified internationally, a lot of people come to join the Human Rights Party. One in particular, famous author Mark Twain. He wrote a piece called King Leopold's Soliloquy, and he shows how all of Leopold's slippery maneuverings were well known. Twain writes this from the perspective of Leopold and puts a lot of his atrocities at the foot of something called the divine right of kings, where oftentimes it was felt that kings could do whatever they wanted because they were chosen by God. Twain, again from Leopold's perspective, says, quote, "They have revealed these and yet other details which shame should have kept them silent about, since they were exposures of a king, a sacred personage and immune from reproach, by right of his selection and appointment to his great office, by God himself, a king whose acts cannot be criticized without blasphemy, since God has observed them from the beginning and has manifested no dissatisfaction with them, nor shown disapproval of them, nor hampered nor interrupted them in any way. By this sign, I recognize his approval of what I have done, his cordial and glad approval. I am sure I may say." End quote. The oldest justification in the book. I am just because I'm the king, and I'm the king because I am just. And if you don't like it, take it up with God. So you had the frontline criticisms of Leopold and the Congo Free State that were often coming from people like Roger Casement, who were on the ground, or Morel, who was publishing accounts that he was getting and writing pieces on his own. You had people joining in, famous authors like Mark Twain, and increasingly towards the end of the Congo Free State, maybe into the last few years before 1908, other countries like Britain were increasingly horrified by what was going on in the Congo. And they could actually use this as a double-edged sword because they could point out how disgusting the Belgian Congo was and show how enlightened their own version of colonialism was in comparison. So they could say, hey, you see all those atrocities in the Congo? At least we're not doing that. And again, regardless of whether or not that was true, they could use the criticism of Leopold in the press to further their own imperial goals. But while all of this human rights campaign stuff is going on, Leopold himself is not sitting still. He begins his own massive counterattack PR campaign that is incredibly modern and sophisticated in scope. Leopold has people in newspapers on his payroll. He has people on the payroll to lobby members of parliament. He has people on his payroll to lobby members of other foreign governments. There was a guy named Sanford who was on his payroll who played a key role in influencing the United States president to essentially help recognize the Congo. And we talked about that in an earlier episode. But he's lobbying members of British Parliament. Obviously, he's lobbying members of his own government. As far as the arguments that he or his agents would make, they used a classic technique called whataboutism or tu quoque. Basically, he says, hey, what's happening in the Congo isn't that bad, and guess what? Stuff in British territories is bad, and German territories is bad, and French territories is bad, so we're going to start publishing all of these atrocities going on there. And so now they can say, well, everybody else is doing it, so what's the big deal? Leopold also starts flooding the zone with media articles that are talking about the humane conditions in the Congo. He essentially subsidized and created his own publishing companies, press bureaus that could publish magazines, newspapers all over the world. He would also intimidate, bribe, and try to co-opt his nastiest critics. He once sent a bouquet of flowers to the wife of one of his nastiest critics, and he addressed it from the mistress of the critic. I mean, this is Regina George and Mean Girls stuff. Adam Hochschild says, quote, "The king did get some artful revenge on one opponent, the influential French journalist Pierre Mill, an ally of Morel's who had fiercely and repeatedly attacked the king in print. One day a courtier brought word that Mill was quietly visiting Brussels with a woman not his wife. Leopold found out where they were staying and sent them an invitation to visit the great greenhouses at the chateau of Laeken. Mill and his lady friend accepted, and they appeared so delighted that Leopold thought he had won over a major critic. But soon after, Mill resumed his attacks. The king then asked the Belgian embassy in Paris to find Mill's home address. To it, he sent a huge bouquet of flowers, with a card bearing the royal coat of arms and the message, quote, 'To Monsieur and Madame Pierre Mill, in memory of their visit to Laeken,' end quote. Like we said, Leopold's also bribing the editors of newspapers around the globe to publish pro-Leopold stuff. And he also makes the classic persuasion move of targeting newspapers and people that used to be very anti-Leopold, and then when he turns them to his side, either with money or some other persuasive technique, this gives you an extra element of credibility. You'll often see this move today where somebody will say, oh, I used to be a liberal, so that means that when I criticize them, that gives me total credibility. Or I used to be a conservative, so when I criticize that side, that gives me total credibility. And of course, Leopold wasn't above simply lying. In a piece published in the New York Times, he said, quote, "I am the ruler of the Congo, but the prosperity of the country no more affects me financially than the prosperity of America increases the means of President Roosevelt. I have not 1 cent invested in Congo industries, and I have not received any salary as Congo executive in the past 22 years. In no shape or form have I bettered myself financially through my relationship with the Congo," end quote. We're going to talk about exactly how much money Leopold made on his Congo ventures in a future episode here, but a direct lie like this in many ways foreshadows a more modern style of political leader who can use the apparatus of the state to enrich himself or his family personally. And it's worth noting that many people in Belgium not only supported Leopold, but they believed him. Historian Matthew Stannard, in his book Selling the Congo, talks about the ways that propaganda was distributed and soaked up by the people of Belgium during this time period. And he cites a quote from Aldous Huxley, who says, quote, "Social and political propaganda is effective as a rule only upon those whom circumstances have partly or completely convinced of its truth. The propagandist is a man who canalizes an already existing stream. In a land where there is no water, he digs in vain," end quote. So Stenard points out how there are these pillars of popular support and cultural support, whether it's religion or the state or people making money off this from private business. And the people can choose whether or not to believe something based on how invested they are in the infrastructure of the lie. Of course, that feels very modern. And there's another element of this media frenzy and shadow war between Leopold and Morel that's going on that feels very modern. It's this. Eventually, Morel discovers that Leopold is traveling to Britain to meet up with a 16-year-old prostitute. He's 65 years old, by the way, and still married. Leopold's exploits at that particular brothel and his relationship with this young 16-year-old mistress would, for many people, be the thing that upsets them the most about what Leopold's doing, not the stuff in the Congo. Now, we're not quite at the end of this story yet, but I do want to fast forward for a moment just in this vein, because of all that money that Leopold says he wasn't making, when he ends up dying, he wills a lot of it to this young mistress. And many people think that she was actually being pimped out to Leopold the whole time for this exact purpose. And so the end of the story is coming in the next episodes, but I'll end here with Adam Hochschild calling this moment where this girl gets this massive inheritance from all of the revenues that Leopold was stealing from the Congo. Adam Hochschild calls it, quote, surely one of the most successful feats of pimpery of all time. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.